1 Kings 18, verses 1 through 17. After a long time, in the 3rd year, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria, and Ahab had summoned Obadiah, his palace administrator. Obadiah was a devout believer in the Lord. While Jezebel was killing off the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them in 2 caves, 50 in each, and had supplied them with food and water. Ahab had said to Obadiah, "Go through the land to all the springs and valleys. Maybe we can find some grass to keep the horses and mules alive, so we will not have to kill any of our animals." So they divided the land they were to cover, Ahab going in one direction and Obadiah in another. As Obadiah was walking along, Elijah met him. Obadiah recognized him, bowed down to the ground, and said, "Is it really you, my lord Elijah?" "Yes," he replied. "Go tell your master, Elijah is here." "What have I done wrong?" asked Obadiah, "that you are handing your servant over to Ahab to be put to death? As surely as the Lord your God lives, there is not a nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to look for you. And whenever a nation or kingdom claimed you were not there, he made them swear they could not find you. But now you tell me to go to my master and say, 'Elijah is here.' I don't know where the Spirit of the Lord may carry you when I leave you. If I go and tell Ahab and he doesn't find you, he will kill me. Yet I, your servant, have worshiped the Lord since my youth. Haven't you heard, my Lord, what I did while Jezebel was killing the prophets of the Lord? I hid 100 of the Lord's prophets in 2 caves, 50 in each, and supplied them with food and water. And now you tell me to go to my master and say, 'Elijah is here.' He will kill me," Elijah said, "As the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today." So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" The word of the Lord.
To this I hold. My hope is only Jesus. Those are powerful words. They have implications that should lead us to ponder. What does it mean to make a declaration like that within our culture, within our society, in our time? Culture is a kind of an elusive thing, but there is one phenomenon of culture, I think, that is pretty consistent, which makes it culture. Culture demands conformity. It demands conformity to something. Now, some of the things that it demands conformity to are probably not all that significant. One of the ones that has never got on well with me is the necessity to conform to fashion. That was not ever my expertise. But during the years when I was a pastor in the 70s, it was sort of not that difficult, because those were the years of make love, not war, and fashion was almost anything that anybody ever decided to do. And one of the things we did during the 70s, when I was a pastor, is wear ties that looked like this. Now, you think that that is perfectly hideous, but let me tell you that if everybody is wearing a tie that looks something like this, it's really quite sophisticated, and it's quite acceptable. That's just the way that it's supposed to be. I left the pastorate and went off of income for several years, and of course, certain things have to be sacrificed when you go off of income. I don't need to explain that to any of you at all. And one of the things that was sacrificed in my case was wardrobe, and in particular ties. So when I came back and began teaching, I wore ties that looked like this. Excuse me. But in effect, what other people were wearing during that time was ties that looked like this, and with careful observation, you can know that there are some subtle differences between these two, which was, of course, noted by my class members. They were quite polite about it. But there came a day when one of my quite bright students was sitting in the front row, right about where Jasar is over there. And I looked at him, and he was looking right back at me with big eyes and a big smile on his face, and there was nobody home. I thought, this isn't a good situation. So I would rectify it, and I said, asked for a certain passage of scripture to be read, and then I said, Hardy. And the lights came on, and he knew that he couldn't say, I don't know. Then he relaxed and he said, I wasn't listening. And I said, I know. And he said, do you have any idea how long your lectures are? And I said, those who endure to the end shall be saved. Well, that wasn't quite the end of all that. That was something that Hardy remembered, and he found out that I really didn't care what he thought of my ties or what anybody else thought of my ties. So for the graduation banquet that year, Hardy organized a tie contest. And to set the standard, he made a class presentation of a tie, which was custom made just for the professor, signed by all of the class, and presented it to me in class. That tie looked like this. And I was required to wear this to the graduation banquet. The names are still on the back of it, exactly the way they signed them. And it turned out to be quite some interesting presentations at that particular banquet. Hardy himself was pretty creative in the tie that he wore. It all ended up being a tie in the end. But it wasn't quite the end of the matter for me, because now I had a reputation. My reputation was having these eccentric ties, and so over my time, they have kept coming. So one of the ties that I was presented with one day by a very good friend was this one, custom made for me. I have worn it once. The occasion was perhaps appropriate. It was the memorial service of my very dear friend, and I wore it in memory of how much he had meant to me. But there were other creative presentations of ties, and one of them looked like this. It's made of metal, and one of them looked like this. It's made of feathers. So if McMaster Divinity College ever decides to have a tie contest for any event, I want you all to know that I'm all in. I'm all ready for the occasion. Of course, there are other things that culture demands conformity about that are a little more significant than just what we wear. Every culture has some kind of underlying ideology. There is some kind of worldview, and it shapes their values, it shapes what's important, it shapes behavior. Now, I asked if there could be a slide shown during this talk, and there it is. I don't know if anyone here recognizes that. This is the east window of the Peace Tower on the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. If you look at the Parliament buildings, that tall middle piece with the clock on top is the Peace Tower. It's got 4 windows, and on the one that faces to the east are these words. and he shall have dominion also from sea to sea. I wonder how many members of Parliament have any idea that these words are on the Peace Tower. And I'm quite sure that almost 100% of them wouldn't want to be asked about it because they wouldn't have any idea where they came from or why they are there on our Peace Tower. But this goes all the way back to the formation of our country. It was something called the British North America Act in 1867, where there was one of the leaders of the forming provinces at the time, named Sir Leonard Tilley, who had a conviction. His conviction was about the sovereignty of God. And his conviction was that this country needed to be built on the premise that God is the one on whom we trust and on whom we depend. And so he proposed Psalm 72:8, and our country is called the Dominion of Canada. I don't think you could find one Canadian in 1,000 who would have any idea what the founding value of our culture was in 1867 when it was formulated by the founders of our Constitution at that time. It brings us to think about ourselves, our times, our culture, and how we are what we have sung, prophets in our time, who know how we should live and who know how we should live within our culture. Now, in our reading today, there are three individuals that have quite differing approaches to culture. The one I'm going to call a cultural conformist. The one I'm going to call the cultural iconoclast. And the other I'm going to call a person in culture with conviction. Now, the last verse of our reading today always strikes me as rather interesting. The backdrop, of course, you all know. Back in 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 1, Elijah begins his confrontation. Baal was the issue in his culture, in the culture of Israel. Baal is the god of rain. Baal is the god that makes you rich. Make no mistake about it, essentially, things haven't changed. This was a purely materialistic culture. And Canaanites had a way of being rich. And Canaanites were the ones that worshiped Baal, and Baal was the one who gave the rain, and so there was always this tendency to do what Canaanites do. So Ahab, of course, was a conformist with the Canaanites. And before we come down too hard on Ahab, I'd like us to think a little bit about his situation. Elijah was the one causing him trouble. Now, Ahaz probably knew something about his own constitution. His own constitution was Shema Adonai, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Yahweh. Now, that wasn't a statement against polytheism. That was a statement about the nature of Israel's God, when you understand it within the book of Deuteronomy. The nature of Israel's God, named Yahweh, was that there couldn't possibly be more than one. If Yahweh is who he says he is, it is only possible for there to be one such person. But of course, there are many other kinds of gods around, whatever kind of powers in existence that they had. And so for Ahab, it was just a matter of not emphasizing this particular distinctive to his confession. Yahweh might be the one who gives the rain, but why do we have to make a big point about that? We can get along with allowing people to think that Baal has some kind of hand in bringing the rain. Now, why would Ahab want to think that way? Well, let me take you to the Kirk monolith inscription, written by Shalmaneser III, concerning the battle at Karkar, the beginning of the expansions of the mighty Assyrian Empire. There was a host of armies gathered against Shalmaneser III, all the way from the area up just to the west of the Euphrates, down to Egypt, essentially. That's a lot of armies and a lot of people, and of course Syrian records are war propaganda, so I don't know how much truth there is to all of the things that are on this inscription. But what it says, what Shalmaneser III says is this: Ahab was there, and he had 2,000 chariots, and he had 10,000 soldiers. Now that's no mean contribution, a little better than what we're doing in NATO these days, let me tell you. And Ahab had status. He had position with all of his peers, and they weren't about to be accepting these kinds of ideas about Yahweh, and he wasn't about to be imposing them, and he found it most convenient just to conform. There was another history. The very first king of Israel, Solomon, well, the second king of Israel, Solomon, had a trade pact with the Phoenicians. It was a good one. It meant that Israel could supply Tyre and Sidon with everything that they needed in terms of food and agricultural produce, and Tyre and Sidon could share with Israel all their rich natural resources of wood and metal and everything else that they needed. Strong economic union. Well, that didn't go away. Ahab's father was Omri. You don't hear too much about Omri in the scriptures, but as a matter of fact, other people knew about him. And in Assyrian records, centuries after Omri, everything was known as the land of Omri. Ahab is the successor to this tremendous political figure who has established this strong relationship with the Phoenicians, a tradition that he's just carrying on. And, of course, as happens in old royal families, he marries the daughter of the king of Phoenicia. And she has her own ideas about tolerance. And they don't get on too well with some of the more faithful prophets of Yahweh. It should seemingly be obvious that if it hasn't rained for 3 years, and if Elijah is the one who declares that there's only going to be rain when he says so, it should kind of be obvious to Ahab that maybe he should reconsider his conformity to his culture. But that's not the way he looks at it. And I have pretty strong sympathy for his feelings. If you didn't cause this drought, we could be prosperous. But Elisha was called to a mission. It was a divine calling. And he was to confront. And he does so in a very appropriate location, Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel, if you've ever been there and stood on the top of it, and I certainly encourage you to go, stands at the head of the whole Jezreel Valley, the whole valley of Esdraelon, which, if you look at it today, it's just rich with grain fields and with food. It was just everything that made Ahab's empire the power that it was. Elijah says, we're going to meet there, and you need to bring all your prophets there, and you know that story. That it is God who demonstrates his presence rather than the prophets of Baal, who don't manage to rouse any presence of Baal at all. And Ahab is then told to eat and to drink because there's rain coming. Doesn't look like much. Takes 7 times, but finally the messenger says, yeah, there's a little cloud over in the west, and before you know, the sky is pouring with rain. So surely that's convincing. But maybe not the way that we think. Elisha is fleeing, ends up at Mount Sinai. It's kind of a Moses experience. The mountain quakes, and shakes, and there's fire, and all of the other phenomena that you associate with Moses, except there's no one there speaking 10 commandments. Actually, there's just silence. And when the silence is broken, there's a question. Elisha, what are you doing here? I've been zealous. I've confronted culture. I'm the only one who doesn't bow the knee to Baal. Well, God says, all right, you go and anoint Hazael. You go and anoint Jehu. And we'll address some of these tormentors of yours. Which, in due course of time, with the war going on against Hazael at Ramoth Gilead, and Ahab's son Jotham is there, the prophet goes and anoints Jehu, and Jehu is all prepared for a coup. And comes storming into Jezreel, where the royalty was then living because of the war going on across the Jordan. And the watchman, of course, is on the tower, seeing who's coming, and he says, I see dust, that's Jehu. I guess Jehu would have fit quite well in Ontario roads because he drives like a madman. And so they know he's coming, and Jezebel knows he's coming. And she knows what's in store. So she dresses to the hilt. She is the queen, right to the end. And she dies as the queen. And Jehu takes over and ends the whole house of Ahab, 70 of the male leaders, which means all of them. He eliminated the rulers. And what changed? Jehu said, you think Ahab had you worshiping Baal? You just wait till you see what I do. You're going to worship Baal like you never worshiped Baal before. Jezebel didn't change. Culture didn't change. What did change? Well, Elisha certainly had a role. There's a place to confront. And sometimes there's a place for direct confrontation, and it was a confirmation for those faithful people of Israel. Yes, there is a Yahweh, and he does control the rain, and there were 7,000 who had not bowed the knee to Baal, and one of them was Obadiah. Now, I wished I knew a little bit more about this Obadiah. Chief administrator in Ahab's royal court, but a devout follower, uncompromising to Yahweh. How did he manage that? And what kind of life was that? And did he not think that somehow or another he was contributing to Baal worship by being the administrator in all of Ahab's court and being the one person that Ahab trusts? In fact, when you're down to almost no grass at all and you're looking for just a trace of water in a ravine or a spring somewhere, and you're spread out looking for a way that you can preserve your animals, that's trust. And I can understand Obadiah's feelings when Elijah meets him, because after all, Elisha's had the habit of disappearing. After he confronted and said there'll be no rain, until I say so. He disappears somewhere there in Gilead, and then he disappears somewhere up in Syria, and no one can find him. And why should Obadiah think it's going to be any different? And he's going to suffer the same fate when he's risked his life. Now, I don't know how he pulled this off. He used the resources of Ahab's royal court to keep 100 prophets alive in secret in caves, and Ahab never suspected a thing. He had certain skills, but he also had conviction. And when it came down to the crunch, Obadiah was prepared to stand up for his conviction and to do what it is that he could as a nonconformist in confronting his own culture. We're no longer under the British North America Act of 1867. In 1982, we brought down our own Constitution. And our own Constitution declared that we were going to have rights. It's kind of become the bale of our time. Rights trumps everything. What's kind of interesting is that was so firmly declared to be rights in the Constitution of 1982 is what we really don't have. We were guaranteed that we would have freedom of speech. Now, we have learned that in the Peel district, the Peel School Board, which is just to the west of Toronto, all books have been removed from the public school libraries that don't meet the test of equity. And what books are among those? Well, among those are books like Diary of Anne Frank. The Diary of Anne Frank does not meet the test of equity and cannot be permitted for the school children of the Peel district to be read in their libraries. And that's freedom? No, it's rights. It seems to me that this is not the time to be complacent. I've gone to hear, actually, I think one political speech in my life. It was not that long ago. It was during the leadership race for the Conservative Party, and this particular person came 10 minutes from where I lived. But the real reason I went to see her as a candidate for the leadership of the Conservative Party is because she's a Black woman, a single mother, who as a single mother earned a PhD at York University in political science, who started her own law business and actually sold that business so she could become an MP and run for the Conservative candidacy. Now, as a woman of conviction, she had one position that she made clear in her candidacy that pretty much sealed her fate right from the start. Canada is the only democratic country in the world that doesn't have some kind of law to protect people not yet born. And so in Canada, it is a right. If there's no law, it seems to be a right. Canada is the only country in the world where it is a right to terminate the life of an unborn child for any reason whatever, and one of the reasons being used, documented well in Canada, is because you don't like the sex of a child, and usually that sex is a girl. And so Leslyn Lewis went on record to say, I will make a proposal that at minimum, we will protect the life of an unborn child if the only reason it's being taken is because it's a girl. She was shunned for that by everyone virtually in the Conservative Party and ridiculed by those in the other parties. Why? We have a cultural value. And if she was going to stand up against that value, she would pay the price. We have a value that says we're in charge of life. We can do with life whatever we want to, as illustrated by the fact of no abortion law, but the other way we're in charge of life is coming out in some disturbing report. Canadian press reported this last month that medical care for seven out of 100 people in Quebec, medical care means a doctor ends your life. So there seems to be something amiss about that as a value, that we can just claim that life is ours to deal with whatever way we want to. How should we deal with culture? How should we live out our conviction? I suggest it takes some careful thought. On Sunday, we sang the words from Martin Luther, Ein feste Burg. We know it as our mighty fortress is our God. These were written in Wartburg Castle in that year when he was taken captive and hidden and lived under a pseudonym so that his life could be preserved. I have no idea what kind of stresses Martin Luther lived through during those days, but the words of that song are powerful. Let goods and kindred go, this mortal life also. God's truth abideth still. Though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God has willed his truth to triumph through us. Truth is not the fundamental value of our culture, but we do have truth. And so our challenge is, as a church, how do we live in our culture with truth that we confess and know?